Folks at 92Y, let me introduce you again. We have this rousing welcome already for Joe Alwyn, who plays Nicholas Eichmann. And
Klaus.
The director of the film, Chris Weitz. And of course, the man himself, Academy Award winner, Sir Ben Kingsley, who plays Adolf Eichmann. So Sir Ben, let me start with you. You had to go ahead and do it, right? You couldn't let well enough alone. You know, you were this close to being an honorary Jew. You played Yitzhak Stern in Schindler's List. You played Simon Wiesenthal in A Murderer Among Us. You played Meyer Lansky in Bugsy. You even played Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, in a television movie. And now you go with Eichmann.
You've left out Moses.
Oh, that's right, Moses.
And you've left out Meyer Lansky.
Oh, no, I didn't. I said Meyer Lansky in Bugsy.
I beg your pardon.
Yeah. So I left out the guy who parts the Red Sea, too. And then Eichmann. It is an enormous... One of the things that's really interesting is I read somewhere that you said that you felt compelled to play Eichmann.
I first became acquainted with Simon Wiesenthal when he telephoned me and asked me to portray him in the wonderful HBO series Murderers Amongst Us.
Has anyone seen this? It's a wonderful film that HBO made in which it's based on the memoir by Simon Wiesenthal, Sunflowers.
That's right. And I therefore, in portraying him, spent many marvelous days with one of the greatest voices of the Holocaust. And for me, it was like being in the presence of an Old Testament prophet. He's an extraordinary man. And he said to a group of friends around us one day, I remember him putting his arm around me and saying that I was like a son to him, and I assure you that he was like a dad to me. I loved him dearly. And of course, meeting him in his office in Vienna, I remember him saying, pointing to the records of death after death after death on the walls of his office. He said, look, this is blood turned to ink. He had a marvelous way of trying to convey the inconceivable and indescribable. When we attempt to describe the Holocaust, the language breaks. But I have been blessed in being in the company of people who can begin to articulate that memory and that truth. After working with Simon on portraying him, I then was invited by Steven Spielberg, not immediately after, I did other films between, to join him on Schindler's List, and therefore met Mila and Poldek Pfefferberg and all the other Schindler survivors who were alive at that time, who visited us on the set, and I met in Israel. And I remember carrying in my pocket, my breast pocket, as Isaac Stern, a photograph of Anne Frank. And before each filming day, I used to take the photograph of Anne out of my pocket and say to Anne, I'm doing this for you. And a few years later, I was invited, as you've kindly pointed out, to play Otto Frank, her father. And during this time, I also became acquainted with and enjoyed the company immensely of Elie Wiesel on more than one occasion, 3 in fact. And the last time I was with Elie, he signed a piece of paper for me on which was written a poem of his. And I told him that if ever I have opportunity to walk on a film set that's appropriate to his story, that I would dedicate my performance to him. And therefore, later, when dear Chris offered me the part of Adolf Eichmann, I knew absolutely that I would have to dedicate my performance to Elie. And that is why you use the word compelled.
I see. I must say, for those of you, I hope you'll see A Murderer Among Us, but there's an incredible scene that I remember in it as you're playing Simon Wiesenthal. I think it's a scene with his wife where you say, I can't stop.
Stop.
Oh, I can't, I just got chills that you said it again. That was creepy. Don't do that, Sir Ben.
I have a very good memory.
And you're too charismatic, okay? We just did lines together. I can't stop, I can't stop. A very powerful moment in that film. You know, given what you just said, I wonder whether you think that this is a special legacy of the Kingsley genre of portfolio of films, that the Holocaust has played a role in this. It's certainly nothing that you've intended, and yet over the years, and you've just given us the examples of how they all sort of came together. But I wonder whether you feel that it's part of your legacy, that you're proud of it, this part of your legacy, that you've made these Holocaust-related films?
But I have promises to keep, and I have miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
Well, we're very honored that you've reminded us of how many of these films that you've made and how powerful these portrayals have been. Now, Chris, the man who brought us one of the Twilight films and both of the American Pie films.
Thank you for that.
Hey, I'm a fan of all that stuff.
That's great.
Just saying.
Thank you for bringing
I wanted to start with your highlights. This seems, for you, different, this work. And I was reminded in reading about this more that this story, oddly enough, was personal to you. Your father was a German Jew as a child who managed to leave Germany in time, and his family did, and they lived in London. And I understand you grew up in New York, but they narrowly missed death. And there's something even more interesting, that your father at one point was writing historical biographies of Nazis.
Yes.
At this level, middle manager Nazis. So obviously, even as a child, I think you were a proofreader on some of these books. This is so powerful that the idea of the Eichmann, the bureaucrat, who plays a part in the Holocaust, was something that was almost oddly part of your childhood.
Yeah, well, my father was fascinated with the phenomenon of normal Germans, or I suppose you could use that in quotation marks, becoming servants and masters in this national and global catastrophe, in part because he was sent away from Germany at age 10 in 1933 when Hitler came to power. He eventually emigrated to the States from Britain and joined the Army, eventually served in the Counterintelligence Corps and the OSS because he was a fluent German speaker. And so the war stuck with him, and he did end up writing books about it, I think in part to exercise his experience of that time. And I was his kind of amanuensis. I organized his library, and I'd do some research for him, and I would proofread his books at a pretty young age. American Pie aside.
You absorbed something else.
Yeah, I was doing other things. I mean, in a strange way, this is much more something that belongs to my upbringing than American Pie, because I never went to American high school. I went to my father's old high school, which we'd called sixth form, and that was where he felt a very strong connection to England, because he felt that he had had his humanity restored after being treated as a second-class citizen. And that was crucial to his life and upbringing, so that's why I ended up there. So yes, it mattered to me a great deal.
I wonder, and the three of you can jump in on this. I mean, do you think, we can start with Chris, that this is actually a Holocaust film? I mentioned it during the introduction. I said, well, it could be a Holocaust film, it's a post-Holocaust film. You could say that it's only tangentially related to the Holocaust. You could say that it's the other side of Schindler's List, right? Because Schindler's List is really about Jewish victims trying to get on the list, and hopefully with the assistance of Yitzhak Stern. And this film is really about Jewish redemption, vindication. There's now a Jewish homeland, and there is Jewish justice seeking here. This is Jews fighting back. It's a very different experience.
Yeah, I think inevitably the Holocaust rings through this entire film, even though it's set in 1960. A Holocaust film, I mean, I'm loath to sort of file anything away in a sort of a convenient pigeonhole, which is, I think, part of the fascination of Sir Ben's performance is that he's not what you would necessarily imagine as a stock Nazi villain, and we had agreed early on that there was no point in trying to do that. So I do, yes, I do agree with the points you bring up about it dealing with whether justice or vengeance is the best thing to pursue. To me, it was also very much about two characters confronting one another, trying to win the struggle over a narrative of what happened. And so I think I think it's agreed, although some people would rather forget that the Holocaust was a catastrophe. I think that there are varying degrees of awareness of how possible it would be to repeat it, albeit in a different key. That this thing lies in wait, and that Germany in 1930 wasn't a unique scenario, unfortunately.
This is a perfect segue for what I wanted to ask Joe, which is that your character is enormously important in this movie. And by the way, the portrayal is, I know the detours that were taken to turn this into a Hollywood film, so I know when we're exactly on point and when Chris Weitz and the screenplay author came up with a different narrative strategy to tell the story. But Joe plays the character of the true believer who inherits the sins of the parents. You know, Klaus Eichmann could have rejected his father. It could be a very different story. He doesn't actually reject the father. A very powerful scene of you know, my father may be gone, but the flag continues, as if I'm unrepentant. I have nothing to apologize for. And I wonder whether that, for your purposes in the portrayal of this, thinking about, well, we have a revival of neo-Nazism throughout Europe. We have extremist right-wing groups throughout Europe. This has become an enormous problem. And we see it, by the way, the Unite the Right rally last year in Charlottesville. What they were chanting was, the Jews will not replace us. And so as Chris says, you know, one switch on the dial, and we're back there. And I'm wondering whether this was part of your thinking as you played Nicholas.
Klaus.
Klaus, right. Isn't it I thought it was Nicholas Klaus, isn't it?
I think Klaus is Nicholas. Klaus.
Yeah, right.
So we're okay.
Right.
Yeah, I thought what I found interesting about him reading it and through speaking with Chris is that he's driven or becomes driven not necessarily at first so much through his ideology, but as much as anything about his love and also fear of his father and loyalty to his father and family. And at the beginning of the film, or near the start with Sylvia, you feel like there could be a kind of epiphany moment where he chooses to go with her and he chooses that path, and that idea or hope is kind of dashed when his dad is kidnapped and he's sucked into the recovery of him. But I feel like that's a path that's taken because of his loyalty to him as much as any kind of right-wing kind of feelings. I think that's all quite abstract to him about what his dad does, about what his dad has done, and about what that actually means. I think it's quite abstract. There was a scene that wasn't in the final cut that he talks to his mum about what he's done and about whether he's actually done it, and it's as if he hasn't actually computed the kind of size and the scale of it. But as time passes, he finds himself drawn that way because of his affection for his dad. He gets sucked that way, and like you say, I mean, today the kind of continual rise of right-wing nationalism is as kind of prevalent as ever, or is very prevalent, and it's like Klaus. I think Eichmann had 4 children. I think Klaus was the only one who followed in his footsteps and kind of took that ideology into his own and followed his dad.
From a filmmaking standpoint, Chris and Sir Ben would probably agree, I think. There's something enormously appealing about the idea of Klaus taking the different course, that he feels a sense of, he's apologetic, that somehow in meeting this love, that when she acknowledges that she's Jewish, he now feels a different way, a different path to redeem the family name. And that's not what happened, and that's obviously not a direction you were going to go with this. I was reminded of a film, I don't know if you ever saw the John Turturro portrayal of Primo Levi in that Italian film, The Truce. It's wonderful. DeSico Rossi made the film. But there's a wonderful scene. We did an event with him, with Elie Wiesel and John Turturro here about that film. And there's a wonderful scene that was changed in the movie from the memoir when Primo Levi, as a Holocaust survivor, is coming off of a train after Auschwitz is liberated, and a German soldier comes to him, and in the memoir, the German officer spits in his face. And in the movie, he bows down and asks for forgiveness. And you can see how, right, from a cinematic, Rossi obviously said, that's just a cooler scene.
It's immensely tempting, I think, to want to seek redemption for characters in certain situations. And I think, somewhat cruelly, the casting, for me, it was really important to cast Joe because he is tremendously warm and winning and not, to my mind, who you would think of as the kind of the mean kid, the rotten kid, the violent kid.
Not a natural extremist thug.
No, not at all. And I think there's
I think he's offended. I think. What do you mean I can't be a thug?
It's a pale compliment. Not a racist thug, but I think there's one slight moment of character for Klaus in that. My mother is actually in this movie. She's
in the movie.
She's in the movie within a movie when the two when Klaus and Sylvia Herman meet in a film called Imitation of Life. My mother, Susan Kohner, played an African American girl passing as white, and the Klaus and Sylvia met at the Cinema York, where we were actually able to film, and I forced into that moment my mother's film. In part because Sylvia is unknowingly passing as Christian, and set up a shot specifically to mirror the earlier shot in which, as opposed to my mother's boyfriend in the film who beats her, Klaus kind of remains still and lets Sylvia go, perhaps to the danger of his own father, which is, I think, why his reaction later is so intense in terms of how he goes over to the other side. I think, yes, I think we'd like redemption, but that is too tidy, perhaps.
So the Klaus character clearly is a prisoner of his history to some extent, his loyalty to his father. But the Peter Malkin character clearly in this film plays that role of somebody who is imprisoned by the memory of what happened to his sister and his niece and nephew. He's obviously a charmer, but not in a way that disconnects himself from the reality of that experience. There is something extraordinary about this, that your cast is, they're traumatized spies.
Yeah.
They're spies, right? They're like James Bond, but unlike James Bond, they're traumatized. They're all suffering from some variation of PTSD.
Yes.
And they're put in this extraordinary situation. I find it really, think about this, that the neo-Nazis are after them. It's a replaying of a history that for them only took place 15 years earlier. It's really recent. It's extraordinary. And I think the film does it. Did you, in terms of working with the actors, obviously that was part of this sense of, we're trained to do this, but are we mentally able to do this? One could imagine them saying, this is just beyond the capacity of a human being.
I think that's important. All of the agents who later wrote memoirs described this terrible feeling of being so close to the agent of so much harm and destruction to their family and to the lives of people whom they loved. And part of their part of it was a sort of a simple horror, but part of it was to see all of this embodied in a human being, in a single human being, and to sort of realize the sheer damage that one seemingly unprepossessing person might be able to do. So I think that the sense of being stuck in this safe house, of becoming caught in their own machinations is important.
Yeah, I was thinking about an anecdote that Avner Avraham, who was a consultant on the film, and I mentioned him earlier during the introduction, and we had an event with him here in connection with the museum exhibit. He told this really great anecdote that the guards, which you saw in the glass booth guarding Eichmann, were Iraqi Jews with mustaches. And do you want to know why they were designated for this part? Not just in the film that you cast, but in the actual trial, because there was a fear that Ashkenazi European Jews who moved to Israel would simply strangle Eichmann in the glass booth.
Yeah.
And that they wanted to get Jews that were as removed, only the Iraqi Jews, as much as they would want to, didn't feel it as much.
Yeah.
That they just figured this case is going to be over because any European Jew is just going to kill him right there.
Yeah.
So another example of trauma. Let's talk a little about what I consider the most complex piece of the film and the most challenging, legally and morally, which is that you step into the Hannah Arendt debate, and you step in forcefully. For those, many of you in the auditorium may know that the Hannah Arendt, who was teaching at the New School, by the way, downtown, she was a German Jewish intellectual who survived the Holocaust thanks to another rescuer, a guy named Varian Fry. And she covered the trial for The New Yorker. And then she wrote a book about it. And the book was called Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. And she had actually a very hard time after this book getting invited to Passover Seders.
Yeah.
Because she said a number of things that Jews particularly didn't like. But one of the things, the most controversial piece, was the subtitle, The Banality of Evil, in which she was saying, look, Eichmann really was just a cog in the machine, right? You see Sir Ben say those words. He was a mid-level bureaucrat. The system is really is to blame. The German Nazism forced him to strip him of his moral core, of his moral agency. And it's Nazism that's the blame that could do this to anybody, that evil is banal, and that it introduces a new moral order, and people just follow the new moral order. And in a way, it ignores what, I mean, I would argue, because I've read the trial transcript, the very strong, unrepentant, anti-Semitic nature of this man. But this movie does an amazing job of humanizing Eichmann. He is not a monster here. And the relationship that you hinted at, the relationship between Peter and Sir Ben, how the actors worked, and I was hoping that maybe we would talk about this, because obviously this was discussed at great length even before you made the movie, because there is almost an odd father-son relationship going on.
Yeah.
Something's going on there. There's like almost a sexy shaving scene, you know? And you would think, God, he's got a razor. You know, it's a good thing we don't have the Iraqis there, because they would have at least known not to kill him.
Right.
So maybe you can speak to this, because I think the film does an excellent job of stepping in with great bravery to say, here's the position we're taking on the Hannah Arendt argument.
To be honest, I don't think that Chris and Oscar and I did indulge in great lengthy debates about this.
No.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
It was natural.
It was an intuitive choice. I think he cast the film beautifully, and it was an intuitive choice. And also, I think to to humanize Eichmann is an odd phrase, because in fact he's human already. That unfortunately was his status on this earth, and to make him a monster would be to relegate him to the role of fictional baddies, and therefore instantly dismissible. But to portray him as highly manipulative, to a certain degree intelligent, vulnerable, pompous,
a family man.
A family man, yes. But these people left the camps, went home, had their sauerkraut, sausage and beer, kissed their children goodnight, and patted their pets. They were people. And this is a very, very hard pill to swallow. And I think to fictionalize these people and calling them, well, they invented the word Untermensch, which means less than human. To use their foul language and say that they were not human is in fact doing history and the victims a terrible disservice. They were people who organized a military machine, a morality, a population, a language, which still hasn't recovered, in my opinion, to serve something utterly bestial. But it was not done by beasts.
I have to say, Sir Ben, Hannah Arendt could have used you in the late 60s, because that was an excellent answer, and she never quite...
Well, I hope that's implicit in my performance.
Yeah, no, I just think that the answer...
That's what we were trying to do.
I think you're right. I think the film is an answer to the book, and I can assure you, as someone who has read widely in this subject, that this film will be thought of in that way. It'll be taught in university courses. It seems to me that if you were going to read Banality of Evil in a university course, you should also see this film. And I actually have a feeling that you'll see years later. You'll call me, Chris, and you say, you're right. This film, people continue to watch it because it's an answer. It's an answer to the book, or actually, it reaffirms a message in the book that might not have been delivered quite as well as Sir Ben. Chris, I wonder if you want to speak to this as well.
I'm not sure I could possibly answer more eloquently than Sir Ben did. I suppose I would add that one unfortunate side effect of treating Nazis as other or as monsters is to absolve ourselves of any of those possibilities. And I think it unfortunately is an evergreen possibility in any country in which ethnic and race hatred can be exploited for power. So I sort of project that forward into the present and future in terms of what was the most responsible way to portray Eichmann.
Can we talk for a moment about the revenge element of the film? You mentioned it, I mentioned it. Is it a film about revenge? Is it a film about justice? Is it a film about both? I mentioned at the introduction, the Argentines, this was an international uproar. A Argentine citizen was kidnapped. This is it's not extraordinary extra rendition, but a citizen of Argentina was kidnapped and taken to stand trial. This wasn't subject to an extradition agreement. And yes, you wanted to get him his signature, but the idea was that, he was being covertly taken to another country to stand trial. Regardless of what he did, they wouldn't have given him up. The Israelis made a decision not to shoot him in the head. He gets out of the bus, and they could have just shot him in the head.
Yep.
President Obama made a decision with Osama bin Laden to shoot him in the head. That was the idea. There was no thought that we should have an Eichmann-style trial in Foley Square. There was no contemplation. You just told them, do not bring him back here. I don't want any speeches. Anwar al-Awlaki was an American citizen who was targeted an assassination in Yemen. His father is an American citizen. I think he's in New Mexico and Arizona. He's still saying, how did that happen to my son? He was an American citizen. So I wonder, to understand the significance of what the Israelis did, that they actually brought him to stand justice in their courtroom. Yes, of course, it's a landmark case of international justice. Yes, it introduced the world to the Holocaust. With the exception of Anne Frank, nothing had done it before then. But in a way, is it justice simply because you're in a courtroom? Is it not justice if you just shoot someone in the head? I mean, certainly he deserved it.
Right.
Well, if you'd shot him in the head, you would not have had that. I don't think anyone would have fully appreciated the resonance of his own declaration that I will leap laughing into my grave knowing that I take 6 million souls with me. I mean, it goes beyond unrepentant. It's glorifying in his achievements. And had he not been hung and asked to talk further, I think he would have silenced every single Holocaust denier in the world. And that's a terrible irony, but he would have said, no, we did it.
Right, because
He
you're
said it
saying...
proudly.
Right, because he was just setting a record, establishing a record
That's right.
of the crime that would have disappeared with him
Yeah.
if you just shoot him in the head.
Absolutely.
Chris, I'm wondering, because this is, you made a decision to tell the story and yes, of course, it's a thriller, and yes, it's a Hollywood film. You could have rebalanced it and told the kidnapping in 1/3 the time. Would have been really fast. You would have missed a lot of cool stuff. And just done the trial.
Yeah.
Right? By the way, there was one, did you ever see the Maximilian Schell film, The Man in the Glass Booth?
Yeah, Man in the Glass Booth, yes.
That's an amazing film. Yeah, you've got to see this, Sir Ben. I think the print is held by the American Film Institute, but I mean, I just think that there's something here that, we tell the story of the kidnapping because there's an excitement, but I think Sir Ben is right. Let us not forget that holding him for 10 days, everything that went into bringing him back had a purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was an act of tremendous forbearance on the part of the people who brought him back. And in that, it was an act of great, for them, ethical clarity to have emerged from that situation, not having used guns, not having killed him, treating him like a human being as opposed to the way that he and his colleagues had treated their people. And then once it got to Israel, I think it was used in an understandable way to air the crimes of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in general. It was a televised trial that was a way to tell a story being told in a way for the first time by Israelis, speaking as Israelis, and rather than wanting to suppress the traumatic memories of the Holocaust.
By the way, which did happen throughout the 1950s. The Israelis, for those of you who know, did not dwell on the Holocaust.
Right.
Their focus was on nation building and building an army.
Right.
And the idea of the survivor testimony did not exist. It's really the trial that is the first place where survivors, this is how powerful this moment was. And the point that Sir Ben is making, that would not have happened had Eichmann been shot in the head.
Yeah,
but you're right. I mean, that this cathartic experience for a nation, perhaps not that much unlike what happened in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You could make the argument that the Eichmann trial is the precursor to that. It introduced the idea of what in law school we would call restorative justice.
Yes.
Right? It's a form of restorative justice. Healing is just as important as punishment, and that in this case it is a form of healing. I mean, there was bloodletting of survivors crying on the stand. I mean, just an endless stream of, I think it was over 100 Holocaust survivors testified.
Yeah.
But that's grief, and grief is also the first step towards healing. And I think that one of the tragedies of post-war Europe in 45, 46 through to 50 and beyond was that process of grief was denied. And I think it's impeded Europe's recovery.
That's fascinating. You're saying Europe, since that is the scene of the crime, needed a real Eichmann trial, not the Nuremberg. Remember, the Nuremberg tribunals was not based on testimony. It was a documents case. The Nazis had left so much documents that you could prosecute them solely on that. And they didn't focus on victims in any particular way, certainly not Jewish victims. But I think Sir Ben is saying, wouldn't it have been interesting if they had had this ability to offer grief also all throughout Europe? Do you think that if that were the case, we wouldn't see neo-Nazis today?
I think we'd see a different Europe, put it that way. It's difficult to predict, but I think that on an individual level, I think to suppress grief will impede your healing, and to be allowed to grieve instead of partying, oh, the war's over, which is completely understandable. But then there should have been also, I wish there was a period of deep, deep grief over what had happened in Europe and the terrible, terrible, irreparable loss that Europe had suffered, and I still think is suffering from.
And perhaps because it's still, there's still survivors on every level from what happened in Europe. And I always think that's the most extraordinary thing about Europe.
Yes.
That this is all the resurfacing of these extremist movements and ideas, these nativistic, nationalistic, xenophobic attitudes, is happening so recent after the crime itself.
I remember when I was last with Elie Wiesel, he shared with us that he'd been praying to God. I think Elie actually had conversations with God, and he told us that he'd said to God after the Holocaust, I mean, precisely what you're referring to, what more do you want? Looking at Europe now and extremism and anti-Semitism. What more do you want?
Right. As if hasn't everything been said and everything already happened, how can it happen again?
Something has not yet quite been said. And this is where Chris is so brave and wonderful in saying, just a minute, I have to say this.
Well, that raises an interesting question I wanted to get to with Joe, which is, after seeing the movie a couple times, my first thought is, not only is this a great and a brave film, but why wasn't it made earlier? It was a movie that it was a story screaming for a movie. Now, I think when I was a kid, there was a television movie.
Yep.
I think The House on Garibaldi Street.
House on Garibaldi Street. And there's another one.
And they weren't very good, and they weren't as earnest as this. It didn't attempt to achieve the level of emotional complexity that you get out of Sir Ben. None of that existed in those portrayals. In fact, I would argue what you said earlier, those were more conventional depictions of the monster instead of a more humanized, not humanized, but fleshed out, fully human, because he was, in fact, human. How did this movie, first of all, what happened? Did you go to the studio? Did they come to you? How come this movie wasn't made? And the reason I wanted to ask Joe is because I'm thinking, he's the youngest one on this. You certainly didn't know anything about this, I suspect, until you were called to make this film. Because it is an extraordinary story, and you would think someone would have thought there's a movie in this.
Yeah, I was ignorant in terms of the actual story. I'd heard about cases of Nazis fleeing to Argentina, but I didn't know Eichmann's actual story. And so when I read it, I mean, there were so many different components as to why I wanted to be a part of it, but primarily it was such an interesting, important story that hadn't been told. And I felt ignorant for not knowing about it. And then on top of that, obviously hearing about Sir Ben being involved and Oscar and Chris, it was an easy choice to make. But yeah, I hadn't heard of it. I didn't know about his story.
So Chris, someone in Hollywood had a light bulb moment and said the Eichmann kidnapping and trial?
It's very hard to get movies of this size and made these days, because movies now have to be about superpowered people punching each other, or occasionally horror movies made for very little money. This is a kind of a middle-sized movie of the kind that used to be made, and it seems to be the only kind that my brother and I really know how to make, unfortunately, perhaps. But the head of MGM at the time, Gary Barber, had a sense that this would be a good story. It was actually written as a spec script by Matt Orton, a young English writer who graduated in history from Oxford and thought it was worth pursuing, and who did a tremendous amount of research in order to arrive at the script. He's extremely well informed, and then we carried it further with Avner Abraham in terms of getting the details of the mission right. I think that it had been tried, people had tried to mount it a couple of times on television. It is kind of extraordinary because some of the more sort of Hollywood details of this story are actually true, that the reason that Eichmann eventually was caught was because his son met a girl who didn't know she was Jewish, and they started dating. And her blind father started to work out that this was, in fact, the son of Adolf Eichmann. There's actually another even stranger element to that, which is that Simon Wiesenthal knew that Eichmann was in Argentina because he had been advised by his doctor to take it easy and take up a peaceful hobby. So he took up stamp collecting, and one of his correspondents in Argentina who traded stamps with him said, "I just saw that swine Eichmann in Buenos Aires." And so Simon Wiesenthal found himself almost against his own will involved in this story again, but the Mossad ignored it, and for a while they ignored the evidence from Sylvia Hermann's father.
Right, which came by way of Fritz Bauer.
Which came by way of Fritz Bauer, who suspected that the Germans would warn the Argentinians, or the Argentinians would warn Eichmann. And the Mossad had more pressing existential threats to their security than Eichmann at the time. So we compressed that time frame, but it's extraordinary how it all actually came to pass.
There's another great, actually, Wiesenthal anecdote that I had heard that you'll love, or you may have already known, was that in addition to the stamp collecting, Wiesenthal had heard that Klaus had somehow written to someone, a friend of his, that he lives in a place where he can ride horses. And that Wiesenthal concluded, well, where can you do that? Right? He didn't say where. So Wiesenthal originally thought it was northern Germany because you couldn't do it in a major city. And so that was another tip-off, that where was there enough places for young Klaus to ride horses. Can we talk a little about the psychological elements to this? Because we mentioned it a moment ago. This relationship between Malkin and Eichmann that takes place nightly. It is fascinating. It's almost action-packed in its own way. And I know that, I don't know how much of this had been planned, but that relationship between them is really, it's supposed to be a kind of psychological game that they're really playing. They're both trying to manipulate each other.
Yeah.
And they're both worried about the similar things. They're worried about families. Do you think that Malkin actually does develop feelings for Eichmann?
Well, I know from his memoir that he developed a strange sort of feeling and even compassion for him as a human being in a predicament. But at the same time, obviously had the deepest contempt for him. I think I think that he's clearly lying to Eichmann at the beginning of their encounter, but that it becomes impossible not to give to Eichmann some of the tools that Eichmann wants to achieve his ends in so doing. They're both attempting to manipulate one another, and yet they're sort of both getting their hooks into each other at the same time. And I think it's interesting that it's about names to me. That's very biblical, that it's by giving up his name and the name of his sister that he really yields power in the situation. Of course, Eichmann, the master of putting together lists of names and forcing names onto lists and forcing those names onto trains, as it were. So to me, yes, there was something very much, very interesting about two people trying to seize the narrative, each from the other, telling each other stories, and trying to move one another towards the ends that they want by telling stories. That was kind of fascinating. I think that that whatever Malkin feels towards Eichmann, whatever he's pretending to feel, eventually all he's managed to give Eichmann is enough rope to attempt to hang himself, as it were.
You know, there's a school of thought that says Holocaust film should never end in a way that makes you feel good. Otherwise, how can it be about the enormity of the Holocaust? You shouldn't have a feel-good, life-affirming ending. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there is something very redemptive about this film. And I'm wondering whether that was the conscious decision in the making of the film, because there is clearly a sense of reconciliation that's being made. And I would argue that even in the making of the film, I understand that in the trial, in the courtroom, in the audience, you filled it with Holocaust survivors from Israel. Is that right? Or not you didn't, but in the actual, I'm trying to remember, did I read something about like who was in the audience?
I cannot claim that.
Mossad agents or something? I thought
no, alas, that would be a great idea.
All right, I made that up.
I wish I had.
That was a wish list. Because it does feel as if the story is being reclaimed.
Right.
Right? That the story is being reclaimed by the victims here. And I wonder if whether all three of you might want to speak to the power of what that's suggesting. Because it just so happens Sir Ben is in what is still considered the signature Holocaust film. And he plays a role in what, and people learn, they claim they've learned about the Holocaust from either Anne Frank or watching Schindler's List. Mm-hmm. So many people have said that's their entrance, their reference point. But this is so different because the victims here are not passive in any way. The victims are moral agents and emotional agents, and in the end, you know, they show the world.
I'll jump in on this one. Well, I think I like films which, if they do end in a positive manner, do it in a rather small fashion. I think it is restorative for Peter Malkin's character. Of course, he's lost a great deal in bringing the ending to pass. He's lost possibly the love of his life and the opportunity to have children with her, and it seems that he may have sort of sacrificed the possibility of a future in order to bring this about. And I think this indicates the possibility of a future for him. He walks away from the trial having done his part and not needing at that point to dwell any further on it. And there is some kind of laying to rest of the ghost of his sister.
Ooh, and that wonderfully shot, by the way, the background, the landscapes of
thanks.
How they completely interchange themselves as if they're moving in out of a very different universe from one through the other.
Thank you. I mean, that only takes a little bit of planning, and to me that beats fancy special effects. Yeah. We just sort of recreated the camera angles that were necessary to do that. Yes, it's a small restoration on his part. However, the players are still on the board in a way. It was going to be another year, I believe, before Eichmann was hanged.
Now, you should know, if Eichmann was hanged, and that was the first and only time in Israel's history that capital punishment was used in Israel, never since and before. The other anecdote is that in the actual story, and this picks up on some of the questions that you just asked, the agents that are left behind in the actual story actually go looking for Mengele.
Right.
Not to kidnap him, to just take him out.
Well, Isser Harel very much wanted to take Mengele with him on this expedition,
right.
on this mission. It wasn't within the scope of our movie to address that, but that was the kind of...
But you introduce it when using Sylvia's father, by introducing it in a very clever way, as if to say, actually the neo-Nazis reintroduced them by claiming that he's around. It's like, okay, well now if you're going to make a big deal of he's around, let's go kill him. Here's a question from the audience which picks up on this theme. Whatever happened to Sylvia? How historically accurate are the details in that case?
Sylvia went to college in America. She is whereabouts unknown, understandably, perhaps. So that's what became of Sylvia. She did actually leave the country.
What about this story that was altered differently, if at all, from the actual story? Are there any pieces that you want to ignore? I actually know some of them.
Sure.
But are there then those decisions? I mean, well, I can tell you one. I can tell you one for sure that Chris won't mind, which is that the doctor, the Melanie Laurent, is that her name?
Yes.
Wonderful French actress. In the actual story is a man.
That's true.
And apparently, I heard from Avner that the family wasn't happy about that for the movie's purposes because they're understandably there was a love interest that was created and it was very useful to have that story for Peter. But that's certainly a different a narrative strategy that was changed. Is there anything else? We can understand that one. The compression of time.
Compression of time. And I'm sorry to sort of take up all the time, but I know where all the bodies are buried. Yes, Sylvia's father was arrested, purportedly for possibly being Mengele, but that happened after the period of the mission. The young woman who was tortured and killed by Nazi sympathizers within the Argentinian police was actually killed after the mission
She was
left.
a student. My
Yes.
memory was that she was a student, and she was not a Judas character either, I think.
She did not give up the mission.
Right.
No.
The one who was tortured is really just an innocent girl, a co-ed at Buenos Aires University, who, when Eichmann is hanged, the neo-Nazis decide to find a Jew and to punish a Jew, and they get her.
That's right. So there are a few juxtapositions and interpolations. The story that Eichmann tells at the very end is an actual documented story that he told to Willem Sassen in one of those strange sort of rather theatrical interviews that he gave. This was to a Dutch ex-Nazi officer, Willem Sassen, who became a journalist. Those were eventually published in Life magazine in a slightly redacted form, and they're pretty extraordinary. That story actually happened, but I don't believe Malkin relates having been told that story in quite the same way. However, they did have rather involved probing discussions about the Holocaust together, according to Malkin. And in fact, Eichmann apologized to Malkin. And I remember someone seeing the film and saying that they didn't like that Eichmann would have apologized. They didn't like that note of repentance, and I don't really think... I think that Eichmann was capable of expressing repentance in a very limited fashion to serve certain purposes, even if it was to assuage his own promptings of guilt or to express to someone with whom he felt a personal connection that he regretted those things which personally hurt that person, but it wasn't by any means a larger thing.
Manipulative.
Yeah.
Just manipulative.
Right, I was just going to say, they were both in many ways manipulators. And that's one of the things that binded them or created a bond. This is a question really for Sir Ben. It reminds me of something that when I saw at the end of the film, I really thought it was incredible that Eichmann was known, when you see the man in the glass booth, these photos, he had a smirk. And there was even a smirk that you see in the passport photo. By the way, if you want to see the Avraham, the exhibit, there's all very interesting things about that picture for the passport.
Yeah.
Because they had to get somebody from Israel who looked a little like him, and as you saw in the film, and then they had him do the smirk, and then they darkened his hair. And so the smirk always mattered, and Sir Ben gets the smirk down beautifully. But let me just ask this question from the audience. You played this as a three-dimensional character, but how did you leave it behind when you're done?
When I was working on, sorry, did I interrupt?
No, you did.
When I was working for Chris, I decided that it would not serve the film if I allowed Eichmann to contaminate me in any way. He still has a density and a force that one must steer clear of. Do not let him speak, kind of thing. So, counterintuitively, I decided to be an actor rather like a portrait artist and have Eichmann sit in the corner of my studio and have my canvas here, my paints here, and me here. And I would work to get him onto the canvas, but never into me. So I had a distinct separation. And I was able to sleep at nights, arrive on time, and do my job, and put him down and wipe the paint off my hands and go away.
And I have to assume, Sir Ben, that in no other Kingsley film did you have to do that with a character.
I have played men that I've loved. I've had that great fortune, but I had to keep him in the corner of my studio. He tried to get in, if you can understand this, even from the grave. He tried to get in, but I would not let him in. I had a distinct pain in my stomach after the film that lasted quite a long time, and it was as if there was an indigestible lump in me that eventually dissolved, and I think it was where he was trying to get in. But I wouldn't let him in.
What a wonderful moment to end the evening. I want to thank Joe Alwyn, Chris Weitz, Sir Ben Kingsley. Keep checking out the website for the 92nd Street Y and the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. Good night. Thank you. Go see this film again. Tell your friends.